One of the leading forces behind the French Revolution and the reign of terror that followed was Maximilien Robespierre. He was a man who would encourage the slaughter and execution of more than 17,000 people who were said to have been enemies of the revolution. Many people were accused of harbouring monarchist sentiments following the execution of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the King and Queen, and many people were quickly taken to the guillotine following trials where they would lose their heads on the efficient device. Robespierre himself flew too close to the sun, and he would also be sent to the guillotine. His execution was one which was celebrated at the same place where the King and Queen also lost their heads, at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Join us today as we look at the ruthless execution of Robespierre, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Maximilien Robespierre was born on the 6th of May 1758 in Arras, and he would, as a young man, study law. But he would rise to obtain an obscene amount of power in France, and in 1789 he was elected to become a representative of the commoners of Arras in the Estates General. It was here where he gained a taste for politics, but France was beginning to get fed up and tired of their king and queen. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had a huge amount of criticism, and the people of France began to hate their monarchy and loathe them. Lots of people were suffering as they had little food and were starving, but the king and queen were having huge banquets in which obscene amounts of money were being spent from the royal treasury. Marie Antoinette also spent a huge amount of money on clothing, jewellery and other luxuries such as furniture, and the French people saw this. Because of this they began to be hated, as did much of the royal family. The Third Estate, which represented the commoners and the lesser clergy, would declare itself the National Assembly, and because of this Robespierre rose to prominence as a man who would hold the ideas of the revolution, and many turned to him to put these revolutionary ideas into power. He became a democratic and a radical figure, and Robespierre hated the king and queen. He looked over the Jacobins, who were a powerful political group that advocated the ideas of the French Revolution and the overthrow and abolition of the monarchy. He also encouraged people to rise up and rebel, especially with regards to their lack of food. Robespierre would speak out for the king to be placed on trial following his arrest, and he also called for the king to be executed and for the monarchy to fall. But Robespierre, because of his power, was very popular, but he did also have some enemies, and he continued to attack the idea of monarchy and call for change. But in August 1792 he became the first deputy for Paris to the National Convention. The monarchy was abolished, France declared a republic, and the king was placed on trial for treason, and Robespierre had got what he wanted. The king would be executed in January 1793, and following Louis XVI's execution, there was a struggle for power within the convention, and there was a lot of tension between the Jacobins and the more moderate Girondins. The Jacobins used the mob mentality and anger to seize control, and they arrested many Girondins and politicians, and the control of France was passed to the Committee of Public Safety, and Robespierre was a leading figure of this, and he would become the most influential and powerful member of this, and also one of the most powerful in France. However, at the time in France, there was a significant amount of worry about European nations who might spring a foreign invasion, as they were angry that the king and queen had been executed. There was a lot of lawlessness and disorder across the country, and the committee then began to hunt anyone who they believed was against the revolution, a monarchist or anyone who harboured anti-revolutionary sentiment. They launched the Terror, or the Reign of Terror, and Robespierre was the leading man behind this. He would state in a speech why it was needed, and he said, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is baneful. Terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." This was a horrific time and a bloody one during the revolution, and radicals seized control of the government, and they did as they pleased. This led to many being executed who were considered to have been against the revolution, and France was being ruled by terror and fear. People were worried about what they said and what they did, and the smallest scent of royalist support could result in someone being arrested or being sent to the guillotine for their execution. Accusations were rife, and there were many people who were executed unfairly, without trial, without justification. There were people who were condemned for cutting down a tree, known as a Tree of Liberty, which was a symbol of the new France, and anyone who uttered the slightest supporting statement for the monarchy was executed. The best way of surviving the terror for many was to not just say anything at all, and to keep opinions to themselves, as they were worried about who was listening in. There were also accounts during the terror of women who witnessed their husbands being executed on the guillotine, and when tears were shed from their eyes as the blade fell on their loved one's neck, they were accused of crying for the condemned. This was interpreted as a symbol of defiance, and the wives would be dragged to the guillotine, where the blade fell on their necks shortly after their husbands. Each week, hundreds of people were being executed across France, and there was violence in the streets. But eventually Robespierre would also fall from grace. As he increased his power and stranglehold over the nation, his popularity decreased. He stated to the National Convention that the new official religion for the nation should be known as the cult of the Supreme Being. But Robespierre was now seen as a symbol similar to a king, a man who was being a tyrant like the former king was, and despite French military successes at the time, the brutality of the Reign of Terror, which was backed by Robespierre, would come back to haunt him. On the 27th of July 1794, Robespierre was arrested with his allies by the National Assembly. A group of rebels banded together to plot against him, and during his arrest there was a firefight and a bullet was fired which struck Robespierre in the jaw and injured him. The next day following his arrest, he was executed. An eyewitness who saw Robespierre's execution documented each step of his journey towards the scaffold and what happened when he got there. This person said, "At 4 in the afternoon, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was universal jubilation coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could do no more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Cauchon, and Henriot were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest, and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman, who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked at her sadly, as she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down into your grave carrying the curses of wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which a surgeon had put onto his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body and the executioner held it by the hair to show the people, it presented an indescribably horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. Robespierre today is seen as a symbol of terror within France, and as a man who would be responsible for the executions of thousands of people. Each day the guillotine was falling on anyone who said anything with regards to the monarchy. It was a time in France that the revolutionaries wanted to put behind them. They would state that Robespierre himself was an enemy of the people, but his time in control would see the nation become lawless and savage. But on the same guillotine that the king and queen suffered on, Robespierre would also lose his head. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.